Welcome, my friends, and let me tell you a gripping tale of murder, betrayal, and the search for justice by a woman who served 10 years behind bars. Enjoy the story. Sarah Johnson stared at the dirty warehouse floor, her calloused hands aching from hours of lifting heavy boxes. Strands of greasy brown hair fell across her pale, gaunt face. Just 2 weeks ago, she thought this backbreaking job was her ticket to a new life after 10 years in a Louisiana state penitentiary. But now it had all come crashing down. Again. "Johnson! Andrews! In my office now!" the warehouse manager barked. Sarah glanced at Kelly Andrews, her coworker and former cellmate. They had stuck together on the outside, determined to go straight. But with their criminal records, good jobs were impossible to find. This gig at Valdez Shipping and Receiving was the best they could get. The women trudged to the manager's office, the smell of stale cigarettes and cheap cologne hitting them as they entered. Frank Valdez, a pot-bellied man with beady eyes, glared at them from behind a cluttered metal desk. "You're fired, both of you," he spat. "I don't want no convicts working for me. A concerned employee tipped me off to your sordid pasts." Sarah's green eyes flashed with anger, but she bit her tongue. Getting into it with this creep wouldn't help matters. Kelly, however, was less restrained. "We did our time! You can't fire us for crimes we already paid for," the feisty redhead argued. "I can and I did," Valdez sneered. "Now get your stuff and get out." As they turned to leave, Valdez fixed Sarah with a lecherous gaze. "What were you in for anyway? You got that hardened criminal look about you." Sarah paused and looked back at him coldly. "Murder." The Louisiana humidity was suffocating as Sarah walked through the dingy streets of her old neighborhood in New Orleans. Spanish moss hung from sprawling oak trees, and the air was thick with the smell of fried catfish. This was a world away from the white-collar life she used to know. Sarah's thoughts drifted to her ex-husband Mark, the man she had supposedly murdered in cold blood. They had been college sweethearts, marrying young and living the American dream. Nice house in the suburbs, good jobs, fancy vacations. The only piece missing was a baby. After years of trying, fertility treatments, and failed adoptions, Mark's eye had started to wander. 6 months before that fateful night, Mark announced he was leaving Sarah for his 24-year-old yoga instructor, Tiffany. Sarah was devastated, but not entirely surprised. She had sensed them growing apart, saw how Mark's eyes followed young mothers pushing strollers down the street. When he said he wanted a divorce, she didn't fight it, just quietly signed the papers and watched him drive away. Half a year later, Sarah returned home from her shift as an ER nurse to find Mark's body splayed on her living room floor, eyes open and mouth froze in a surprised "oh." She called 911 in a panic, watching helplessly as the paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene. The detective on the case, a hard-faced man named Bill Warner, immediately pegged Sarah as the prime suspect. "He dumped you and you were angry," Warner accused her. "A woman scorned and all that. You poisoned him to get your revenge." "No, I didn't. I hadn't seen Mark in months," Sarah protested. But it was no use. The medical examiner found a massive dose of Sarah's prescription sleeping pills in Mark's system. Her fingerprints were all over the apartment. There was no sign of forced entry. To the cops, it was an open and shut case. Sarah Johnson, 35, murdered her ex-husband in a jealous rage. At the trial, prosecutors painted Sarah as a cold-hearted killer. Her own friends and family turned against her, believing she must have snapped. Her attorney, an overworked public defender, barely put up a fight. Sarah was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 15 years in prison. As the bailiff led her away in handcuffs, she locked eyes with Mark's brother Andrew, his face etched with hatred and disgust. Sarah would never forget the smug look of satisfaction on Andrew's angular face as she was dragged down to hell. Sarah slammed her shopping basket down, the metal clanging against the checkout conveyor belt. After losing yet another dead-end job, she was back to pinching pennies and clipping coupons just to eat. As she watched the cashier ring up her meager groceries, rice, beans, canned tuna, white bread, she thought back to her stint at the Eunice Hunt Correctional Center for Women. Her first day, Sarah was terrified, sure she would be eaten alive by the hardened criminals surrounding her, But her cellmate Kelly took her under her wing, showing her the ropes and keeping the more predatory inmates at bay. Kelly was in for murdering her abusive husband Denny, a meth head who took sick pleasure in beating her senseless and molesting their 2 young daughters. After one particularly brutal attack, Kelly had grabbed a kitchen knife and fought back with all she had, stabbing Denny 16 times until he lay dead in a pool of his own blood. No one could say Kelly didn't have justifiable cause. But the small-town Louisiana jury saw things differently. They found Kelly guilty of manslaughter and gave her 12 years. Her girls placed in the foster system. Kelly was angry and bitter, but not at the system that failed her or the man who tormented her for years. She reserved her rage for herself, for not killing Denny sooner, before he could lay a hand on her babies. Sarah and Kelly formed an unlikely friendship behind bars, bonding over their shared pain and determination to survive. When Sarah was paroled after 8 years for good behavior, she promised to stick by Kelly on the outside. She was there the day Kelly was released, a plastic bag with her meager possessions in hand. They moved into a cramped studio apartment in the 9th Ward, sleeping on stained mattresses on the floor, and subsisting on food bank handouts. But they were together and they were free. After being fired from the warehouse, Kelly still found work as a janitor at New Orleans General Hospital and helped Sarah land a job there too. Scrubbing bedpans and mopping up strangers' bodily fluids wasn't exactly Sarah's dream career, but it paid the bills and kept her parole officer off her back. Their co-workers, a gossipy bunch of nurses' aides and orderlies, quickly sniffed out Sarah and Kelly's histories. "I heard that one's a killer," Tamika Watson, a young LPN, whispered loudly as Sarah pushed her mop past the nurse's station. "Offed her husband for insurance money." "Well, I heard the redhead stabbed her old man and watched him bleed out," Sharice Brown replied with a shudder. "Never trust a woman who's done hard time." Sarah and Kelly endured the daily indignities and sideways glances. In this post-conviction life, it was all they could do to keep their heads down and muddle through. That was, until the night Sarah met Nadine Bellamy and everything changed. It was after midnight and the hospital's fluorescent lights cast a sickly pall as Sarah buffed the beige linoleum. The ER was quiet for once, the usual stream of drunks, overdoses, and knife fight victims tapering to a trickle. Sarah was looking forward to clocking out and falling into bed. Suddenly, the emergency room doors burst open, and a pack of paramedics rushed in alongside a gurney. On it lay a hugely pregnant young woman, her face contorted in pain, a sheen of sweat on her ebony skin. She let out a guttural moan, hands clasped over her distended belly. "Nadine Bellamy, 29, 36 weeks gestation," a harried EMT called out. "Severe abdominal pain and vaginal bleeding. BP is 80/40ths and dropping. Baby is in distress." The ER sprang to life, doctors and nurses converging on Nadine and barking orders. Sarah watched anxiously as they raced the gurney to a trauma room. She knew all too well the fear and anguish of a pregnancy gone wrong. The brief time she and Mark had conceived, Sarah miscarried before the end of the first trimester. They never found out exactly why Sarah couldn't carry to term, but she always blamed herself. Maybe, she thought, if she had just relaxed more, taken better care of herself, maybe then she'd be a mother and Mark would still be alive. Sarah shook off the dark memories and kept mopping. It was almost an hour later when she passed by Nadine's room and heard a soft voice calling, "Nurse." She stopped and peeked her head in. Nadine was alone, her face sallow and streaked with tears. She had an IV running into one arm and fetal heart monitor strapped to her belly. "I'm not a nurse, sorry," Sarah said awkwardly. "Let me go find someone." "No, don't leave me, please," Nadine begged, extending a trembling hand. "I don't think I'm going to make it. The doctors, they had a look on their faces. I could tell." She choked back a sob. Sarah didn't quite know what to say. She wasn't equipped for this, for serving as confessor to a dying stranger. But something in Nadine's plaintive gaze drew her in. She tentatively stepped into the room and moved to the young mother's bedside. "Is there anything I can do?" Sarah asked softly, lightly touching Nadine's shoulder. Nadine nodded and motioned to a crumpled piece of paper on the rolling tray table. "I wrote a letter explaining everything. If I don't make it, I need you to keep it and not give it to Andrew. Andrew Dardano. Promise me." She gripped Sarah's wrist with surprising strength. Sarah swallowed hard, mind reeling. Andrew Dardano. Mark's brother, Andrew. The man who stared her down with such contempt all those years ago. What could this stranger possibly have to tell him? "I promise," Sarah managed. "I'll deliver the message if it comes to that. But I'm sure it won't. You're young. You're strong." Nadine smiled sadly and relaxed her grip, sinking back onto the damp hospital sheets. "Bless you," she whispered. "Bless you." Just then, a phalanx of doctors and nurses pushed into the room. "Miss Bellamy, your blood tests show your liver is failing. The baby is in severe distress. We need to do an emergency C-section now to try to save him." Sarah quickly excused herself as the medical team converged on Nadine. She retreated back to the service elevator, letter clutched in her shaking hand. Nadine's son Romeo was delivered by cesarean at 1:16 a.m., robust and pink and screaming. But by the time he took his first breath, his mother was already gone. Sarah stared at the crumpled letter on her dingy apartment floor, head spinning. According to Nadine's final confession, she hadn't just known Andrew Dardano. She had been sleeping with him and helping him murder his brother in a sick, twisted bid for Mark's money. Nadine claimed she stayed quiet for years, too terrified of Andrew to act. But as her due date approached, and she thought of the innocent life inside her, she knew she had to come clean before it was too late. She started documenting everything, writing down dates, places, and verbatim conversations. She even recorded a few of their fights on her phone and saved them on a flash drive. Now here it was, the truth literally in Sarah's hands after all these years. She could scarcely breathe as a tidal wave of emotions crashed over her. Rage at Andrew for stealing her life, relief that she had been vindicated, crushing grief over the husband she hadn't killed and the family they never got to have. As tears streamed silently down her hollow cheeks, Sarah heard keys jingle in the apartment door. Kelly. With trembling hands, Sarah shoved the letter back into its envelope. She would tell Kelly everything. But first, they needed proof. Sarah carefully replaced the letter, then locked it in the cheap safe under their sagging couch. She needed to be smart about this, to make sure the police would believe a two-time felon over a grieving brother and upstanding businessman. Andrew Dardano strode through the hospital corridors like he owned the place, his Ferragamo loafers clicking importantly on the dingy tile. When the hospital called to inform him Nadine had died, but his son survived, he knew he had to move quickly. The little bitch probably blabbed their secret to someone. If any evidence of their scheme got out, he'd be ruined. Everything he worked for, murdered for, would be lost. Andrew spotted a tired-looking resident in wrinkled scrubs and puffed out his chest. "You there. I'm Andrew Dardano, Nadine Bellamy's fiancé. I need to collect her things." The doctor blinked and shuffled some charts. "Ah, yes, my condolences, Mr. Dardano. If you'll just head to the nurses' station, they can help you with any personal effects." But Andrew was already barreling past, making a beeline for the bank of patient lockers near the trauma rooms. He had to find that damn letter and flash drive before anyone else did. Just as Andrew reached Nadine's locker, he heard an angry shout. "Hey, what are you doing?" He whirled around to see that convict Sarah and her little ginger crony in their janitor get-ups. Sarah was clutching a manila envelope, eyes blazing. "You lying murderous bastard," she spat. "It was you all along. You killed Mark and let me rot in jail for it." Andrew froze momentarily, then quickly composed himself. He straightened his silk tie and smiled thinly. "Sarah, unpleasant as always. Still spouting your paranoid delusions, I see. You're not well. Let's not make a scene, He took a menacing step toward her, expecting the women to cower. But Kelly moved protectively in front of Sarah. "You don't scare us, pretty boy," she growled. "We know everything. Nadine wrote it all down. How you and your junkie buddy roofied Mark with Sarah's pills. How you were fucking Nadine on the side and got her knocked up. It's over." Andrew felt rage course through him, but he maintained his cool facade. "You really expect anyone to believe the ravings of two pathetic junkies over me? I'm a respected businessman. I have the police chief on speed dial. No one will take your word over mine." "They don't have to," Sarah said coldly. "We've got you on tape. Nadine recorded everything and it's all in here. She waved a small flash drive. Andrew felt his veneer crack as panic rose in his throat. He lunged for Sarah, determined to snatch the drive, but Kelly intercepted him with a sharp elbow to the face. Andrew stumbled back, blood spurting from his nose. "You bitches!" he snarled, voice muffled through his cupped hands. I'll kill you both." "No, you won't," said a deep voice. Andrew spun to see two cops flanking a hospital security guard, guns drawn. "Andrew Dardano, you're under arrest for the murder of Mark Dardano," said the taller officer. "You have the right to remain silent." As the police cuffed Andrew and read him his rights, Sarah sagged against the wall, knees weak with relief. Kelly put a steadying arm around her and whispered, "We got him. It's over." Sarah watched through tear-filled eyes as Andrew was led away, still bleeding and screaming obscenities. She knew it was far from over. There would be trials, media circuses, painful rehashings of the past. But for the first time in a decade, the truth was finally out. She was free. 1 year later, Sarah Johnson stood on the sprawling veranda of the Dardano family mansion, bouncing a babbling Romeo on her hip as the warm Louisiana breeze rustled the stately live oaks. If you had told her a year ago, as she walked out of prison with nothing but the clothes on her back, that she'd be here, the lady of the manor, raising her one-time rival's child, she would have laughed in your face. But fate was funny that way. After Andrew Dardano was convicted of murdering his brother Mark, and Nadine's evidence came to light, Sarah found herself in the unexpected position of being the sole guardian of Mark's estate and his orphaned nephew. She petitioned the court to adopt Romeo, refusing to let an innocent child get lost in the system like her friend Kelly's daughters had. The media had a field day, painting Sarah as a crazed husband killer out to steal her victim's fortune. But when the truth about Andrew's deception was revealed, the story changed to one of a wrongfully imprisoned woman fighting for justice and family. Sarah decided to sell her story rights to a major network, netting a hefty sum and a series of primetime interviews to tell her side. She used the money to buy Kelly a cozy bungalow on the other side of New Orleans, far from the memories of Andrew's abuse and Mark's murder. Kelly fought hard and got her girls back from foster care, determined to rebuild the family she once lost. Sarah knew she could never repay her friend for her steadfast loyalty during their darkest days, but she was grateful beyond measure. As Sarah looked out over the manicured grounds of her new home, Romeo cooing contentedly in her arms, she reflected on the strange twist that had led her here. She thought of her own lost babies, the ones she and Mark had never been able to bring into the world, and felt a pang of wistful longing mixed with gratitude. She finally had the chance to be a mother, to shower a child with all the love and devotion stored up in her wounded heart for so long. Sarah knew the scars of the past decade would never fully fade. There would still be nightmares, still be days when the weight of her losses threatened to crush her. But as she gazed at Romeo's perfect cherub face, so like his uncle's, she made a silent vow to be the parent he deserved. Blood be damned. She would not let the sins of the father poison this innocent soul. "It's just you and me now, little man," Sarah whispered into Romeo's wispy curls. "We've been through the worst of the storm, and I promise from now on, I'll make sure we get nothing but clear skies." Sarah turned and carried her new son into the grand foyer of the house, ready to begin the next chapter of their lives. She had emerged from the darkness, battered but unbroken, and she was determined to walk in the light.